welcome everybody. We've got a great turnout today. Thanks for saying hi and letting us know where you're from in the chat box. I'm Candace Shively with Utah State University Extension. We also have Satal joining us from USU. We are both associated with USU's Center for Water Efficient Landscaping, which is the organization that supports these events. This month, we are fortunate to have Michael Dukes joining us from the University of Florida. He's going to discuss his research with smart irrigation controllers, their effectiveness in reducing water use, and whether or not they're a good choice or a good fit for rebate programs. As always, we'll do our question and answer session after the presentation. Don't hesitate to use that Q&A box at any point to put your questions in there, and we'll get to those at the end. And we will email out CEU information after this event is done. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Michael.
All right, thank you very much. Thanks for the invite. And here we go. And everything looks good.
Looks
all right,
great.
Thumbs up. Well, welcome everybody. Great representation from across the country. I saw North Carolina, lots in the West, lots of Utah, which I would expect. Seattle, California. So some of you know me, I know some of you. It's good to be here. Candace asked me to talk about smart irrigation controllers. And in particular, are they a good fit for utility rebate programs? So I know how people like to get right to the point. So that's it. Yes, is my answer to that. I'm not going to leave you there because as with anything in life, the devil's in the details. So there's a lot of important details. You'll hear me talk about smart controllers and kind of compare and contrast them with indoor programs like toilets and so forth. The details matter here, so let's get into it. Well, I always open my talks with the why, and if you're from the Western US, you don't need to know the why. You're living the why. You all have seen these headlines, and really dramatic steps are being taken, banning turf grass in Las Vegas and things like that. So it's a serious situation. I think I hope to convey that I think smart controllers can be a path, probably one of many paths that are going to be taken. But a little bit about our part of the world here. We're a growing state. We are an urbanizing state. And a lot of people look at Florida and say, wow, you've got a lot of rain, 50+ inches of rainfall a year. That is true. That is a lot of rain, but we have population growth, sandy soils. Virtually all new construction has irrigated landscapes. So that does cause an immense demand on our public utility systems where potable water is used for irrigation. And there's, even though we like to try and use alternate sources, potable water is the source in many cases. So two technologies of smart controllers. We use that word smart controller and lump two separate technologies under that nomenclature, and that is ET controllers, evapotranspiration controllers, known as ET controllers, soil moisture sensor controllers, and you may hear me refer to those as ET and SMS. The ET controllers are also called weather-based irrigation controllers, WIBICs. Both of these have a label through the EPA Water Sense program. The soil moisture sensor controllers receiving a process to be labeled. That process was recently completed within the last year and a half or so. ET controllers have had a label since for about 10 years, I guess, maybe a little bit more than 10 years. So let's step back in time a little bit. A decade ago, a little more than a decade ago now, I wrote a paper kind of summarizing the state of these controllers. And the question then was, do these work? Because manufacturers were approaching utilities and asking them to rebate them. And the question really was, do they really work? Do they save water? Do they result in more efficient irrigation? And at that time, there were 7 peer-reviewed journal articles. So you can think of these as research studies. There were 10 study reports. These were largely utility reports of rebate programs or studies that utilities had done. And the outcome of this summary was that the research study showed 40 to 70% savings. Wow, that's amazing. But in practical application, from implementation in the field, there was less than 10% savings. So why was there this large gap? We're going to get everything I'm going to talk about is going to get into that. And some of that was in the early days, there were giveaways of controllers. So controllers got given away and they weren't necessarily even installed. In many cases, they weren't installed properly, programmed properly. In some other cases, they ended up in customers' hands that were not high irrigators to start with. So for all of these reasons, there was a kind of a low impact in the early days. And a little teaser, things have gotten better, but we're going to talk about that. So in the beginning, ET controllers were largely created by startup companies. You can see some of these controllers here sort of look prototypical. And these companies followed the process that had been used for decades in agriculture of using ET and then estimating plant water demands and then scheduling irrigation accordingly. More about that in a minute. But over time, these companies, some of them still do exist. Many of them didn't make it through the time period of the Great Recession where business went down. And then others were bought up by the larger, or their technology was bought up by the larger irrigation companies. Soil moisture sensor controllers have been around for decades. Many people think these are newer to the market, but they've actually been around for many decades. The question is, have they been successful for many decades? And I think the answer is largely, somewhat mixed, but largely no. The technology just wasn't there until maybe the last couple decades. And they have gotten to the point where they are robust. In other words, they will last for a number of years. And again, many of these were small companies and sort of the same story. Some of those companies still exist. Some of that technology was bought by the large companies, but there's a number of them out there today. So ET controllers, there's two basic varieties, sensor-based and signal-based. They are what they sound like. The sensor-based controllers have some type of on-site sensing, whereas the signal-based are sent, they are either sent weather data or they are sent an ET signal from a weather network. In the early days, say 10 plus years ago, the sensor-based seemed to have favor with the manufacturers, but now what we're seeing is signal-based have there's more interest in signal-based. There's just well, we'll talk about why, but in the early days, the signal-based was more difficult. You had to have sort of proprietary networks. The weather data weren't as available, and some of the manufacturers had a fee for that signal to transfer the data, and that became a problem where a user may not pay the fee, a $5 to $10 a month fee. It's out of sight, out of mind, and then you have this expensive at the time $500 to $1,000 controller that became a fancy timer on the wall. That's all changed. So as I said, in the early ET controllers, they utilized the agricultural approach to ET estimation, crop ET estimation, and then that leads directly to irrigation scheduling with two methods of ET estimation through FAO 56 or the ASCE EWI method, both of which are widely accepted in agriculture and now in the landscape controller market. These two methods are very similar on a daily basis, virtually the same for all practical purposes, and they're modified Penman ET methodologies. So they're kind of state of the art in terms of how do we estimate ET. And then you use, for agriculture, use this KC or crop coefficient as an adjustment factor to adjust this ET number to estimate crop ET. And ET, you multiply the KC by a reference ET, and that reference ET is determined from weather parameters from a weather station like you see here. There are weather networks in many states, certainly big ones like California, the SMS system, and many other states in the West and even in the East are weather networks. So this data has become more readily available over time. And what the manufacturers did is they said, well, this is not an agricultural crop. It's not a a monolithic planting of one single crop over hundreds of acres. You know, it's a landscape. It's got multiple plant types, different densities, shade, no shade, etc. So this concept that is used or developed in California, WCLS, the Water Use Classification of Landscape Species. The approach there was to sort of modify the KC concept into a KL, or a landscape coefficient, which is then derived from a species coefficient. So that's the inherent ability of that, or need of that plant to for water. So transpiration rates differ across species. KMC, or microclimate, is it in a shady or a sunny area, and everything in between. And then KD is a density coefficient to account for how dense those plantings are. So this concept was married with the ETC concept in early controllers to calculate ET. And essentially what they were doing is they were calculating the amount of water in the soil. That's what these equations lead you to in a daily soil water balance. And then when that water depletes to a certain point, then it's time to irrigate. That's what the controllers were doing. There are many controllers out there now. I think there's over 800 on the EPA WaterSense list that have a label, ET controllers. And there's many variations of this theme, many ways to simplify it, which has been done over the years. We're going to get into some of that. So here's an example of 3 controllers that we have tested over time from left to right. You can see the weather, the on-site weather sensors are quite varied between these controllers. On the left is a Rainbird ESP SMT-E, which is no longer available on the market, but it had a rather large looking sort of weather package. And there were some even larger than this in the early days that measured wind speed, solar radiation, relative humidity, and really to calculate ET from all those basic components. This one measures temperature, and it uses a simplified number of simplified methods to estimate ET based on temperature. And you tell it where you're at, so it knows your latitude, so it can get at solar radiation estimates. And it also has a tipping bucket rain gauge. This was kind of an innovative thing. You don't see this too often in these controllers, and it's likely due to, you know, the complexity and customer satisfaction over time. But that does lead you to a more accurate estimate of irrigation needed if you're measuring the precise amount of water rainfall that occurs on site. Moving to the right, this is a Hunter solar sink, so you can see the weather sensing package there from the front of it. It has a solar radiation sensor and a temperature sensor, and in the back where you can't see, there's an expanding disk rain sensor. Much like the one here on this Weathermatic Smart Line, that's an expanding disk rain sensor on the top, and there's a temperature sensor embedded within this shield. So they all approach it in different, the concept of scheduling based on ET in different ways, and that carries throughout the entire industry. So there's a lot of ways to do this. But as I said, probably all of you have in front of you or in your pocket your probably close to $1,000 computer that you're carrying around, you know, a smartphone. Can't see it in the camera, but we have access to this weather data now, which is, it's just everywhere, and it's easy. It's much less expensive than it used to be. So manufacturers have tapped into these weather data sources and are now using this in their signal-based controllers. One other innovation that's happened is using apps to connect to the controller. And here's 2 of many, but the Ratio, that's the one on the right, that is really the only way you interact with that controller to program it. And these manufacturers have gone to a great deal of effort to make this as simple as possible, because when you get into all of these controllers, particularly ET controllers, the more settings you have, the more complicated it is, and that translates into the more difficult it is to communicate that and educate your customers of that. The one to the left there is the Hunter HydroWise, which is also has that app capability. And customers love this. The people who get these, they really like it. They like to interact through the app. With some of them, like the HydroWise, you can set up a contractor account, and if a contractor is putting these in, then they can, if a customer goes in and changes the controller via the app, the contractor can always revert back to the original programming. So that's a really nice feature for contractors, and they can kind of oversee many controllers that they've installed. So lots of advantages to this. Switching gears to soil moisture sensor controllers, there are two basic approaches, a bypass approach and an on-demand. I'm going to focus on bypass. On-demand is really where you turn the irrigation on based on soil moisture and you turn it off based on soil moisture. So usually this is multiple probes at multiple depths, maybe multiple probes within the irrigation system. Typically these are 2-wire, so they're meant for campuses. Think college campuses, office parks, kind of larger schools, larger areas that are irrigated tend to be quite expensive, but for that application, that makes sense. The bypass controllers are the add-on to an existing timer. They do not turn the irrigation system on. I'm going to tell you about that. So soil moisture sensor controller, obviously the soil moisture sensor has to be buried in the planted area, and you want that sensor in the area where the plant is extracting water. So in not just in the root zone, but in the active root zone where the water extraction and refilling due to irrigation or rainfall is happening. The lower left photo here just kind of shows you an example of a soil moisture, an SMS controller interface, and it's connected to a rather old time clock. So these will work with any 24-volt time clock. More on that in a minute. But you can see here that in this turfgrass area that the sensor's buried pretty shallow. This is our sandy soil, by the way, here in Florida. So it's buried about 3 inches deep. So the soil moisture sensor controller consists of this interface device you see there on the right, connected to a timer. These happen to be the same brand, but they don't have to be the same brand. So they'll work with, any controller will work with any timer. There are some soil moisture sensor controllers that are what the EPA calls a plug-in device. And those could be a timer like you see here that comes with the ability to talk to that manufacturer's sensors. So those are proprietary when it comes to that communication. But for the most part, many of these are what the EPA calls an add-on device, where you add this interface to an existing timer and then install the sensor in the irrigated area. So quick recap, a typical timer will irrigate at the day and the time of irrigation. It will initiate irrigation for however many minutes you have set in that timer. Pretty simple. If you add a soil moisture sensor controller, you can think of it as being in line with the common wire. Well, that's actually how it's wired up. And then the decision to irrigate or not will either proceed based on the soil moisture content, or it will be bypassed. But don't leave the sensor in bypass position. Correct. So in this example, we have measured water content of 7% and a set point at 12%. Don't get hung up on the numbers. These are actually typical numbers for us in Florida. They would be very different anywhere else, but don't get hung up on the numbers. The point is that the measured value is lower than the set point that you have programmed in. These numbers vary depending on where you're at, depending on your soil type. They vary depending on manufacturer. There are different numbers in different devices, depending on what the manufacturer, what process they use. But in any case, you probably get the point that, hey, it's below the set point, it's drier. That means it's going to allow irrigation, and that would be correct. In the alternative case, where water content, measure water content at the day and the time of irrigation, remember the timer's controlling all this, at the day and time of irrigation, it's above the set point, so the interface will bypass that scheduled event. And so all the irrigation in that timer, if it's a 4-zone timer, 10-zone timer, nothing's going to irrigate. Okay, that's the important point here. So this soil moisture sensor controller will not turn the irrigation system on. It's either going to let it run or not. So there's two important points there. The threshold has to be programmed properly in the interface, and then the timer schedule has to be programmed properly for a reasonable irrigation schedule, whatever that is for your region. Moving on. There are two flavors of connectivity, wired and wireless. Of course, these days, we're all into wireless everything. And when I give talks or trainings on this, everyone gets excited about wireless because, you know, they start thinking about wired, especially in a rebate program with a retrofit. Wow, I've got to put that wire in, and the sensor needs to go on the other side of the house to where the wire needs to go. That means we're running a lot of wire. there's already utilities in the ground we have to be aware of. I've got to run it under a driveway. It just increases the hassle factor, and in practical terms, it increases the cost because the labor of putting that in will be higher. Wireless, everyone's excited about, but most of these are, there's only a couple on the market, and the ones I'm aware of are pretty much line of sight, so that can become a problem. And then you have battery issues over time. Even though the manufacturers strive to make the batteries last as long as possible, you're still going to have a battery device there that will need to be attended to in time. And then 2 years, 3 years later, when the batteries run out, no one remembers where the sensor's at. So there's all these little issues. As I said when I started, I think they're a great idea, and I think they can be great, but you have to weigh the application on an individual case-by-case basis. So how deep in our soils, like I said, in that active root zone for turf, our warm season turfs here in Florida, that's going to be probably about 3 inches. The active roots are probably around 6, maybe 8 inches. There are roots that go deeper than that, but that's like one single root where 80% of the roots are in that top 6 inches. So that's where we have recommended to put the sensor. That could be slightly different in your area. My guess, if it's turf grass, it's probably going to be in that 3 to 4 inch zone. I've had contractors tell me in the Midwest that they put the sensors 4 or 5 inches deep, maybe even a little deeper than that, to avoid aeration. And they have had success there. The problem is if your soil moisture dynamics kind of are like this. In time, they go up as water's added, then down as the plant extracts water. As you go deeper in the soil, that signal is dampened quite a bit, to the point where if you go out of the root zone, then the signal you're getting is just water input and drainage out. You're not getting, you have to capture that ET signal where the water is taken up by the plant. All right, so recently in 2020, the end of 2020, I did an update on where we're at. Went through the literature and looked at what we had in terms of referee publications. There are now 17 publications, and many of the publications, 10 plus years ago, were from us in Florida. We were doing a lot of work, and there wasn't much going on anywhere else. But now there's been work in New Mexico, North Carolina, California, Colorado, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really gotten out there. That's really nice because you have a variety of soils, a variety of weather conditions, different people trying these out, and writing about the pros and cons. And in summary, the research studies are very similar, 40 to 61% savings versus that 40 to 70% savings. And in practical application, about a 30% savings. And that's, when I say practical, that means as real world as you can get with these studies. So that's really good news. And that's, at least in the research studies, typically that savings is relative to a generous timer-based schedule, because it always depends on what you're comparing it to. So it's good to see in the real world that you're seeing reductions of around 30% with these devices. Now, something I want to talk about, that if y'all are in the business of doing water conservation rebate programs, you know this, there's the human factor. I want to say it's probably even more so with irrigation controllers, because the humans have to interact with it. It has to be installed properly, maintained, and programmed properly. So proper installation, I'm going to give you 5 seconds to 10 seconds to tell me if you think this looks good. I gotta know. Yeah, I don't know why this rain bucket was or this sensor module with a tipping bucket rain gauge was installed under a palm tree. I'm guessing it was a lot easier to install it there than anywhere else, because you got to get a ladder to put it higher, or you've got to run wire to move it away from that tree. But yeah, this is common sense. I mean, let's see. Maintenance. Yep, you got to maintain sensors. You got to maintain, everything needs maintenance. And this is another reason why these signal-based controllers are favored by many people, because you're receiving that signal. Be careful. If you all have ever looked at WeatherBug or Weather Underground, if a manufacturer is using those sources, I've got a WeatherBug weather station near my house that it never gets rain in Florida. I don't know what's going on. So you still have to be careful, even if it is a signal-based system. Soil moisture sensors and probe location. How about here? Does this look like a good spot for a soil moisture sensor probe? I see someone saying slope. Too much shade. That might have been the previous slide. This is probably not a good location. You've got the houses are close together, and a lot of times this area in between, yep, people are pointing out shaded from two sides. Usually this is a shady area depending on the orientation. It's also often a drainage way. It's also often, it's constructed often that stormwater is designed to run through here. You have irrigation systems coming from both sides. So if you're sewing your sensor for your system here, it's probably going to be plenty wet plenty of the time. So there's probably a better location, maybe here in a sunnier location. So these things are, like I said, it is common sense to a certain extent, but you know, we're all human, and sometimes we want to take shortcuts, and that will alter the effectiveness. How about, I talk about this all the time, how about a smart controller on a broken irrigation system? I think no, I think not a good idea. At the very least, the system needs a visual evaluation so that you don't have broken heads, clogged heads, things like that. You don't necessarily have to go do an audit with a full DU test, but at least a visual evaluation or assessment and check it off. Yep, all the sprinklers are spraying. They look like they visually have adequate coverage, and then you can move on from there. And then there's just the surreal, you know, I don't know. I'm without words on some of these things, but you know, like I said, it's still common sense. I'm going to wrap us up today with a story about a longer term project that we had the privilege of working with Orange County Utilities in Florida, and that's in the eastern, sort of toward the east of Central Florida, near Walt Disney World. And this study was initiated 10+ years ago, talking about it, and then implementation was probably a couple years. The idea that Orange County Utilities wanted was they wanted to look at a couple different types of technology, soil moisture sensors and ET controllers, and they wanted to implement those on single-family homes in the county on excess irrigation users. Single meter, these customers by and large all had single meters, but they gave us the monthly potable meter data for 3 years prior to the initiation of the project, and we analyzed that data, estimated indoor use on a per capita basis, and then the residual we said was irrigation. They had at the time just over 130,000 single family homes, and we analyzed those data, compared those, used weather data to compute ET from a typical landscape, like I talked about before, using similar equations. And then we analyzed their data, and they had to be excess users for at least 3 months for every year of those 3 years prior to the study. So these were really, really excess irrigation users. And to take it even a step further, we calculated the theoretical demand at about 36 inches per year for this region. And so we said, well, we're doing a lot of estimating here. We're assuming lots of things. So we want to make sure they're excess customers. So we said 1.5 times that on their average use, up to 4 times that. So that ended up being almost 4.5 inches per month, up to 12 inches per month was our kind of our bracket. Because under that, we weren't sure if they really were excess users. And you can see the majority, we see this in utility data all the time, that the majority of customers are low to no irrigation, 10 millimeters per month. That's not even ½ inch per month. It's probably not even irrigation. So we identified 7,400 potential customers that were excess irrigators. The county sent out letters to these customers, and we ended up getting 800+ responses. And then that started a process of us contacting them, visiting them, evaluating them. This is a map of the county. The diagonal line here roughly splits 2 soil types in the county. Above that line are sandy soils. Below that line are flatwood soils. Flatwood soils are sandy by texture. They tend to have a bit more organic matter, maybe 1.5% organic matter, maybe as much as 2, probably not more. They are formerly swampland, basically, poorly drained areas, and they've been turned into residential areas, but they shouldn't need as much irrigation. So the county wanted to look at those 2 soil types, and you can see how the cluster, I think we ended up with 167 or 169 homes, single family homes in the study, and they were clustered into really mostly subdivisions, neighborhoods, and then some other areas. And the clusters were for 2 reasons. One, convenience. If we needed to go visit with them, which we attempted not to do once the study was kicked off, we didn't want to intervene and change their behavior in any way, practically speaking. But the other reason was because we put a weather station either in the subdivision or proximate to it, and we wanted to have rainfall data within about a half a mile of all of our homes, since rainfall for us contributes a great deal to the plant demands throughout the year. Okay, so we split those customers up into 5 groups: ET, ET plus OPT, SMS, SMS plus OPT, and comparison. The comparison homes didn't get any intervention. They didn't get any technology, any controller. Every single home got an an evaluation. We did that visual evaluation of the irrigation system. And if we had more time, I could tell you stories of that. It was quite entertaining sometimes. We made sure the systems were, they didn't have gross errors, leaks, breaks, clogged heads. Those had to be repaired or corrected before they could be part of the program. And then we came in, we had a single contractor do all the installations. The ET and the SMS were installed by that contractor to the best of their knowledge. We didn't do really any training. And then, but we had them on the plus OPT groups, we had them install them using the best practices that we had developed over a number of research projects over the years. For example, all these homes received a day of the week variance. In this region at the time, it was 2 day a week. During the summertime, 2 day a week water restrictions, 1 day a week in the winter. And what we did on the OPT groups, we restricted those to 3 days per week. Three days where there were water windows per week for those. Whereas on the ET and SMS, they got 7 days per week water windows. And they tended to irrigate 7 days per week on some of those. Some other things, we made sure the soil moisture sensor was installed by digging a hole in the OPT group, by digging a hole and inserting that sensor into an undisturbed wall of soil so that you have roots that aren't disturbed. The sensor is right under that growing grass. You backfill the hole, put the sod back on it, and you're good to go. Whereas the contractor dug a hole, put the sensor in the hole, backfilled the soil, and then put the piece of turf on top of that. So that piece of turf has to recover now. You know, you've just kind of ripped it out of its home, and so there's going to be a transition period there. That's not the ideal way to do it, but that's one of the things we wanted to test. So those are just some differences between those groups. Programming the ET controllers, we measured the application rate of each zone using the flow meter, and the contractor used mostly defaults in the control. So long story short, 5 years of research. The comparison homes are on the left. This is average irrigation applied in inches per week. Every single intervention, ET, OPT, SMS, OPT, every single intervention saved water significantly. And the water savings is up here on the top. The OPT did not always lead to more water savings compared to the non-OPT, but half the time it did. For example, you can see here, the ET, OPT on the sand soils use significantly less water than the ET. In contrast, on the flatwood soils, the soil moisture sensor OPT utilized less water. So the OPT never used more water, but half the time it used less water. So we think there's some benefit to those best practices when it comes to installation and programming. And so where are we now? Well, in Alachua County, Florida, that's where I am. That's where the University of Florida is at, in Gainesville. All new systems have to have a smart controller, basically a water Sense certified or labeled smart controller. California, I kind of get mixed stories when I talk to folks. Some of you probably know, but I thought maybe smart controllers were required under MWELO, the Model Water Efficient Landscape Ordinance, but some other people told me no, they're not required. But currently the CEC is adopting, they're working on adopting the WaterSense specification for controllers. So I wouldn't be surprised if in a year or 2 years, California requires controllers. Somebody asks OPT, that's the optimized, that was programming the controllers based on our recommended best practices. And then of course, as you all know, numerous utilities rebate controllers throughout the country. So I'm going to close with that and open up for questions. I don't see any in the Q&A just now. Okay, so I see some questions coming in on the chat, which that's fine for me, I think.
Yeah, so Keith Silva asked, do smart controller have common error in irrigating to meet evapotranspiration?
I wouldn't say they have errors in irrigating to meet ET. I would say some of the things that we've seen and some of the work that we've done and some other studies that I've seen, if a customer is a deficit irrigator and you install an ET controller, you may increase their water use. Because the controllers are designed to irrigate to what the plant needs on a theoretical basis. That may be more than it needs to meet that customer's objective. You know, they may be fine if it wilts a little and it doesn't look so great. So that's something to really consider in rebate programs. We encourage utilities to look at their customers and look at their water use and rebate these devices to customers that have potential water savings. So in other words, excess irrigators. I know there's all kinds of problems with that because you know there can be political and economic challenges with that. Sometimes you're rebating controllers to people who are, you know, sort of the wealthier people who are irrigating. But from an engineering standpoint, that's what you would do. You would go to where the problem's at.
Isn't there a way to tweak the settings in the evapotranspiration controller, say like only irrigate 50% of ET, or is there a way to do it?
Oh yeah, you can do all that. Yeah, you can do all that. Other questions?
I don't see anything on Q&A.
I think I can stop sharing now.
Michael, I'm really curious. You talked about the audits or the evaluations that you did with the homeowners. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious, what's your favorite or most memorable story from those evaluations?
Oh yeah. I wish I had the photo. I should have put it in the talk, but I can think of the photo. So this customer was having pressure problems. They weren't getting enough pressure to one of their sprinklers. So they just installed another sprinkler right beside it. That didn't help. Water was coming out of another device, but less water, you know what I mean? So that didn't help. Lots of systems, you know, it's weird. I don't know if it's like this anywhere else, but in the Central Florida area, it's a strange place, in my opinion. There's just so much housing and so much development. People literally, they drive their car into their house, in their garage, they walk in their house, and the next day when they leave, their car leaves the garage. They don't walk outside their house. They don't ever walk around and look at things. Like they could have a huge pipe break and it's just gouging out water. And because we have sandy soils, a lot of it just goes straight down. But it just baffles me that people don't pay more attention to things like that. Maybe that's me. I'm probably the weird one. It's me. It's me, not you.
I did notice, and I'm sure all of you noticed, that with COVID and people being home more, just the increase in the number of questions that we got.
Yeah.
Okay, we got a question in the portal. It says, given all your research with systems and type of controllers, given all your research, which system and type of controller have the largest saving by Rachel?
Okay. I'm going to give you an answer. It's probably not the answer you seek. A lot of people, they want to know what's the best one to buy. Well, the best one to buy is the one that works for you or your customer. It may not be the best one. There's, you can set up any of these. And if it's on an application where there's excess irrigation, they will reduce that irrigation. I've heard people call me in the industry, they call me the soil moisture sensor guy. I'm not necessarily, I like the idea that soil moisture sensors they'll see water from either irrigation or rain. So like one of the things that we did in the Orange County study is we programmed the plus OPT group for the soil moisture sensors. We programmed those for 3 days per week with water windows, and we programmed a water window in the morning and one in the evening. And by the nature of our rainfall in the summertime, that evening event is probably never needed. And by the way, the amount of water programmed, let's just say ET was 1.5 inches per week. So Monday it was programmed for 1/2 inch, 1/4 inch in the morning, 1/4 in the evening. Same thing for Wednesday and Friday. And that evening, that second event, daily event's probably not needed most of the time in our summertime because we get rainfall. I've seen soil moisture sensor controllers not irrigate for 3 months in the summer in Florida. You just don't need the water because it rains. Now, an ET controller can do the same thing. The concern I have for ET in our region is irrigation is supplemental. We get so much rainfall that it's actually harder to schedule irrigation in a rainy climate than it is in a climate where there's no rain. If there's no rain and you know ET, you know your plant type, the controller just does it day after day. So measuring rainfall on site or getting some kind of rainfall, capturing that information in an ET controller is very important. And a lot of ET controllers do not measure rainfall on site. They have an expanding disk rain sensor, which I could have another sermon on that separately, but they're just not that great. They require a lot of maintenance. So that's my concern for the humid area. For a dry area, I think ET controllers are great where you don't get a lot of rainfall during your irrigation season. So that's my long answer to a short question. Yep, Chris says usually the biggest problem is landscapers not understanding how to set a smart controller. They usually make it worse due to ignorance. I've seen that 100 times. I've seen in the early days of soil moisture sensor controllers, I had a contractor call me, he said, these things aren't working. That was weird because for the last 5 years, we put in 200 on our research sites and never had one fail, but he just had 15 of them fail. Well, he used wire nuts and they need waterproof connectors because what a lot of them do is they transmit a digital signal from the sensor to the interface device across the valve wire. It's kind of like Wi-Fi over AC lines, if you've ever heard of that. You got to have a clean electrical signal. So you can't just use wire nuts in a valve box that gets flooded with water every other day. So just a real basic mistake. And the manufacturer even supplied the proper waterproof connectors and he just didn't use them. So, I agree, Chris. Josh says, did this research create opportunities to reach other high users that didn't initially respond? No, we didn't pursue that. That's an interesting question. And it's interesting, you all, if you're in the rebate business or in the utility business, reaching customers other than them to complain is always a challenge.
So there's a question about technology. Technology is only as useful as the operator. How do you think we should address the disconnect between the potential water savings and proper homeowner instruction? Yeah,
we've done that. I'm an extension, as our Utah State friends here are. So we've done that through education. We've done training events for utilities, for contractors. So we have a program right now working with Tampa Bay Water, and they're doing a rebate program for smart controllers. So we've done several training events for contractors. So the contractor has to go to that training event before they're eligible to install the device. So is that perfect? No, but it's something, it at least gets them there, gets them part of the way. And then I think you have to do, for rebate programs like this, this is not a water efficient toilet. You install the toilet, you're done. It's just going to save water. Here, because of the all the things I talked about, you have to have some follow-up. So I think, you know, if you have a small program, you could probably look at everyone you're doing in the early days. If you have a huge program, you could spot check, you could have a certain number, you know, we're going to spot check 5% of our program homes and see if they're saving water. And then you kind of track the problem down that way. Keep the questions coming.
Yeah, I don't see any more questions.
So I'll ask you all some questions, or a question. Are smart controllers common in Utah?
Candice, do you want to take that on?
Yeah, I feel like they're common because I work with them so much, but the reality is I don't think they are. They're definitely growing. We have a statewide rebate through the Division of Water Resources that'll give you, I think it's $75 back towards the purchase, which is a really good, really great deal. But even just looking at my friend base and the number that have the smart controllers, it's a pretty low percentage.
Yeah, no, I don't think it's common here. It's in fact,
oh, Zach just put in the chat box there. There's 5,000 that they've distributed. I'm assuming that's through the rebate program, Zach, across the state. Yes, thank you.
And 5,000 out of probably you don't know this, but 5,000 out of how many controllers were installed in that same time period? Total controllers.
That's not a large percentage.
Well, you know, the rumor I hear on the street is about 20, maybe 20% of controller sales are smart controllers. It's pretty good, but it's, you know, it's not massive. There was a question. I don't want to lose that.
Yeah, I can repeat that.
Go ahead.
By Keith Silva. On some smart controllers, the initial program is based on estimated peak irrigation. Do you think subsequent use corrects this? I think some tweaking could be necessary with particularly well, any of them, some tweaking, and that's what I'm talking about with the follow-up. And that's what makes this harder as a rebate type of product. I'm not discouraging you, but you know, there's definitely a learning curve, and there may be, you know, when you leave there after installing it, or when a contractor leaves after installing it, someone has to look at what's going on over some period of time. I think there was another question. Cindy says, I feel our rain events are so predictable in the Wasatch Front that I do not need a smart controller, but I have driven to my rental properties to turn off systems. Excellent point. A smart human is as good as a smart controller. If you're watching and managing your system, or you know, for years we've said we could educate people, but the reality is most people don't take an interest in that. It's just not part of their life. So they want this automatic device. Good comment. Are there programs that offer customer savings for utility control of the smart controller, similar to what power companies do for HVAC controllers? Good question. I have heard of utilities looking into this. Particularly, there's one big utility in the West that's looking into this. They have this as an interest to be able to take over the control for either peak shaving or for water conservation. What's kept a lot of utilities from doing that over the years is if you do that, you sort of assume liability now for the landscape. So if you turn people's controllers off and you nuke their landscape, you know, it's a new world. You could be responsible for that. So that's kept utilities away. But I think the water issues brewing in your part of the world, in the West, are such that we're going to see things like this, see ideas like this. Did you all see any other questions come in? There's some good chats in the chat. Most new homes have them installed. Central control systems for large subdivisions. So the question is, have you considered a central control system for large subdivisions? Some developers do that in Florida, where you know, an irrigation zone is 4 houses. Often they're on an alternate water supply, either usually reclaimed water or some kind of surface water supply. But that's not, I don't think that's as common, because that requires a lot of infrastructure cost for the developer up front.
Whereas with a single family home, once they sell it, it's not their problem anymore. Sorry if you're a developer on here, and I'm not trying to offend you, but I think that's the reality. But I will say this, for those centrally controlled systems, we've seen them, usually if things can go bad, they go bad in a really, really, really big way. Think if you're mismanaging, if an individual is mismanaging their house, that's one thing. But if someone is mismanaging 2,000 homes, that's a whole nother ballgame. Central control. Should the same programs be targeted based on structure, count, or site-based water use? I'm not sure what that means exactly. Maybe a water budget? I love water budgets. People don't like them here, though. They're, I don't know, I like them. They make sense.
It's rebates.
Should the same program structure, count, or site-based? I'm not quite sure I understand that comment from Keith. Oh, here we go. Keith writes again. Should the same program be targeted based on structure or site-based water use? Rebates. I think so. I mean, I think these devices should be targeted to high users. Why would you put one of these on a site that's not a problem? And you have that in Utah, Candace, in some of the work that you all have done with Joanna and Kelly Cobb, with the maps, and you can see where the water use is and the utility, whether they're excess irrigators. I forget the words they use. They use high, excess, okay. So that can be targeted, but like I said, utilities are sometimes hesitant to do that because you have equity issues. You're essentially paying for what tends to be wealthier people who use a lot of water. You're paying them to not use a lot of water. But many people here leave irrigation management to their mow and blow gardeners. Those folks are not well trained. Yep, I would agree. That's an issue. But we're seeing all kinds of things. We're seeing requirements for education, licensure for irrigation professionals. You're seeing lots of different ways this is going to kind of come together. All of those things which would make smart controllers even a better option. When people are educated and they know what these things are. We have kind of a niche community here of individuals, customers who they love products like the Ratio. You can order it online, you get it. It's like a tech device, really, and they take an interest in it. And it's pretty neat to see that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Just the accessibility of it is really. I still wouldn't say we have a lot in the state, but it's definitely increased.
There is a question by Jeff. If central control for a subdivision or community was an option, would commercial and municipal lands be required to participate in this program to offer more cost saving to residential customer? Would this make sense?
Not sure I fully understand the question. I in my experience, I do know that the urban developments, planned developments that have central control, it's on homes, it's on, the little village center, it's everything. It controls everything. Yeah, we have users who consider smart controllers as water use meters and they take them out. Yeah, another story, in the early days of soil moisture sensors, again, I get these calls, hey, they're not working. Well, they installed the soil moisture sensor came with a pigtail, a little piece of wire that's meant to be extended to go where it needs. And the contractor did not extend the little wire. And so when he wired it in, the sensor ended up near the air conditioner condensate line. So irrigation wasn't needed ever. I can't make this stuff up. It's just,
So Jack, right, I wonder if smart controller rebates should be done by the utilities and not the wholesaler, as we don't have direct access to the AMI data and hence cannot follow up or make sure they're using the technology correctly.
Oh yeah, you don't need AMI data. I mean, you can, certainly AMI data is great, but monthly data reads will provide you some insight. It'll take a little more time maybe, but you can tell from monthly data. Mark wants to hear my presentation on rain sensors. Yeah, we'll have to do that sometime, Mark. I'd be glad to do that sometime.
Yeah, I'll follow up on that because I think that would be interesting. Because they're pretty inexpensive, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. I was just trading emails with an extension agent here today. They're required by law here. Either a rain sensor or a soil moisture sensor is required by law on all irrigation systems. I'm not going to spill it, but yeah.
Okay. Well, this was awesome. We really appreciate your time. I want to be respectful of everybody's time here in the event. If you do have further questions, feel free to email those to us and we'll get them to Michael. I will email CEU information out and we'll get this up on YouTube if you want a refresher. Cool. Thank you for your time, Michael. We really appreciate it.
Very good being here. You all have a good afternoon or evening, depending on where you're at.
You too.
All right. See ya.
See you, everybody. See you next month.